Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Sophie of Prussia, Catherine of Russia. When Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst was born into a minor noble family in Stettin, no one imagined that this bright-eyed, curious girl would one day write one of the most glorious chapters in Russian history. She was born an outsider, but destiny chose her to rule an empire. Distant Russia was, to Sophie, nothing more than a strange name, an icy, vast, and mysterious land. But at the age of 14, an invitation from Empress Elizaveta Petrovna opened the gate of fate. Sophie was chosen to be engaged to Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian throne, as part of an alliance strategy between two dynasties. In a carriage crossing Europe's snow-covered fields, the young girl carried not just luggage, but a heart burning with ambition. She had no idea what awaited her, only that this opportunity, once given, must not be wasted. The price of the crown was her self-eshiv. Upon arriving in St. Petersburg, Sophie understood that to survive, and more than that, to win, she had to become truly Russian. No one forced her to convert, but she did so willingly. She abandoned her Lutheran faith and converted to Orthodoxy under the baptismal name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, or Catherine, a name that would become legendary. No one made her learn Russian, but she studied day and night, eventually speaking more fluently than her fiancé Peter, a German who made no effort to assimilate. While Peter immersed himself in toy soldiers and Prussian military games, Catherine quietly read Voltaire, Montesquieu, and other Enlightenment thinkers. At long, dazzling court banquets, with candlelight dancing on powdered faces and cloaked power, Catherine learned to observe. She saw false smiles, double talk, and the calculations behind every embroidered robe. In that silence, Catherine forged a weapon silent but sharp: intellect. One marriage, two strangers' bears. Her marriage to Peter was a chess game without love. Catherine was not naive. She quickly saw that her husband was childish, incompetent, and unpopular in the Russian court. Peter idolized Prussia, an attitude that deeply irritated Russian nobility. He neglected Catherine, flaunted his mistress, and often drank himself into stupors. But instead of lamenting her fate, Catherine quietly prepared. She built alliances with military leaders, persuaded nobles to support her, and maintained the appearance of a loyal wife, all while operating as a shrewd strategist. When Peter ascended the throne in 1762, Catherine knew the moment had come. The night of overthrow and the day of coronation. Just 6 months after Peter's coronation, Catherine launched her decisive move. With the support of the royal guards and many nobles, she orchestrated a bloodless coup. Peter was captured and later died under mysterious circumstances. Some said he was assassinated, others said he took his own life. But regardless of the truth, Catherine ascended the throne, not as a consort, but as an independent monarch, bearing the title Catherine II the Great. The Russian throne no longer belonged to the traditional Romanovs, but to a foreign-born woman who claimed it through cunning, courage, and intellect. Reform, through steel and ideals. Upon taking power, Catherine ruled not only with authority, but with vision. She built schools and libraries, encouraged the arts and culture. She exchanged letters with Voltaire and Diderot, turning her palace into an intellectual center. But Catherine was no dreamer. She understood that vast Russia needed a firm hand. She suppressed peasant uprisings, expanded territory through wars, and brought Russia closer to Europe, without ever abandoning its distinct identity: a woman in a man's world. Under Catherine's reign, Russia not only doubled in size, but also gained unprecedented respect on the international stage. Yet what made Catherine truly great was not just her victories or reforms, it was that she achieved all of it as a woman, in a century where women were expected to stay silent and stand behind. She once wrote, "If anyone ever thought I did all this just to gain the throne, they were wrong. I did it to prove that I deserved it." Catherine lived long and ruled for 34 years, longer than any other empress in Russian history. When she died, she left not only a mighty legacy, but also an enduring example of willpower, wisdom, and the courage to defy every limitation of her gender. The coup of 1762, when a woman dared to draw her sword and shape an empire's fate. June 1762, Russia had never known true peace. In the velvet-draped halls of the Summer Palace, the air was thick with conspiracy. Officially, Peter III was Tsar, but in truth, the throne had already begun to tilt toward another, a woman whom the entire court believed was merely silent and submissive. But Catherine remained silent no longer. For years, she quietly built connections with military commanders, especially those in the elite and fiercely loyal Izmailovsky and Preobrazhensky regiments, forces more devoted to Russia than to the German-born emperor. She knew well that Peter's arrogance and pro-Prussian stance had completely isolated him. Even the Orthodox Church had begun to distance itself from the new king. Peter, meanwhile, was preoccupied, playing with toy soldiers. In the meantime, Catherine was crafting a complete coup strategy. On the morning of June 28th, while Peter was vacationing at the Oranienbaum Palace, Catherine rode on horseback to the regiment's barracks. She wore the guard's uniform, a shocking image, a woman with a sword, swearing before the soldiers, asking them to protect Russia from an unworthy king. The troops roared, "Long live Empress Catherine!" Less than a day later, the guards took control of St. Petersburg. Peter, panicked and without any real support, fled but was quickly captured. In his diary he wrote, "I would rather give up the throne than shed blood." A feeble statement, perfectly reflecting the incompetence that led to his deposition after just 186 days on the throne. Peter died a few days later under murky circumstances. Rumors claimed he was assassinated on the orders of Catherine's supporters, but no official investigation was ever conducted. Catherine never spoke of him again. To her, the past had been sealed with iron and blood. On July 9, 1762, Catherine was proclaimed Empress of all Russia. She did not ascend by inheritance, nor by the side of a husband. She rose by the power of the military and the will of the people, a rare occurrence in the history of European monarchies. In her first speech, Catherine declared, "I did not come to rule because I am Peter's wife. I rule because Russia needs a true leader, and if no one else will do it, then I shall." The beginning of a reign of control and enlightenment, ascending the throne amid the smoke of revolution, Catherine was anything but soft. She consolidated power by eliminating rival factions at court, ensuring absolute loyalty from the army and the nobility. But what set her apart wasn't the iron fist, it was the clarity of mind. She initiated sweeping reforms, establishing public schools, drafting a new legal code for the empire, though it was never fully completed, reforming agriculture and administrative management, promoting the translation of Western philosophical works into Russian Fireplace. She could suppress rebellions, like the Pugachev uprising, through military force. But to build a nation, she chose knowledge. Catherine called herself a student of Voltaire, and indeed, she maintained correspondence with many of Europe's leading intellectuals, turning the Russian court into a hub of Enlightenment discourse in the Slavic world. However, Catherine was never an idealist. She supported Enlightenment principles, but not at the cost of political order. She expanded the rights of the nobility, tightly controlled the serfs, and banned the common people from bearing arms. In her reign, she chose control first, reform second, a strategy that made Russia stronger, but also more conflicted. From the coup to the pinnacle of power, Catherine did not merely seize the throne, she claimed history itself. She once wrote in a letter to Voltaire, "If I were just an ordinary woman, I would have chosen a quiet life. But when history placed me at the crossroads of fate, I had only one choice, to go all the way or be crushed." Catherine went all the way, not with cold blood, but with extraordinary clarity. Not to avenge her husband, but to reshape the empire she chose to call home. And thus the coup of 1762 was not merely the fall of an incompetent king, it was the rise of an era where a woman dared to dream beyond all that society expected of her. Love and politics, when the heart becomes a piece on the imperial chessboard. In the early years after the coup, when the throne was still cold, Catherine knew well, political power could not rest solely on intellect and military force. In a vast empire where power was a double-edged sword and loyalty shifted with every toast of wine, she needed people who would die and live for her, not just out of reason, but out of passion. Grigory Orlov was such a man. The Orlov brothers were brave officers with influence among the royal guards. Among them, Grigory, ruggedly handsome, not particularly refined in intellect, but unwaveringly loyal, became Catherine's first lover after the coup. More than a lover, Orlov was her right hand in orchestrating the overthrow of Peter III. To Catherine, he symbolized two things: force and emotion under control. She granted him power, noble titles, and even bore him an illegitimate son, Alexei Bobrinsky. But that love never dimmed the light of politics. When Orlov began to grow arrogant, thinking he could possess both her heart and her throne, Catherine gradually withdrew his influence, gently, as if nothing had ever been. Love, to Catherine, was never surrender. It was an arrow she used at the right time, on the right person, and always ready to retract when it no longer served. After Orlov came a series of names remembered in history not just for their looks, but for how they served her political aims. Stanislav Poniatowski, Grigory Potemkin, Alexander Lanskoy, Platon Zubov. Each lover was an unspoken contract, where passion, tenderness, and strategy coexisted in the chambers of the palace. Stanislav Poniatowski, the lover who became king. If Orlov was military strength, then Stanislav was intellect and diplomacy. This young Polish nobleman met Catherine when she was still a Grand Duchess, and their love blossomed through pages of books, long nights discussing philosophy, and glances that could not hide their passion. When Catherine took the throne, she did not keep him as a long-term lover, but elevated him to become King of Poland. Not out of love, but strategy. At that time, Poland was a land that could be controlled indirectly if someone aligned with Russia took the crown. And indeed, Stanislav became king, but also a pawn easily manipulated by Catherine. They no longer loved each other, but the political bond between them lasted for decades, until Poland was partitioned and Catherine had complete control over Eastern Europe. Love ended, but the objective did not. Grigory Potemkin, a kindred soul. Among all the men in Catherine's life, perhaps only Potemkin was truly seen by her as an equal. He was not just a lover, but also a co-ruler of the empire, though unofficially. Rumors claimed they were secretly married, but that did not matter. What mattered was that Potemkin understood Catherine, understood her ambition, her loneliness, and the weariness behind eyes that always had to stay alert. He helped her expand southward, brought Crimea onto the Russian map, and was the mastermind behind the development of new cities, later known as Potemkin villages. Even after they were no longer lovers, he remained her advisor and soulmate until the end of his life. This love, if it could be called that, was a fusion of soul and reason, rare and more enduring than all the others. The young faces, Lanskoy, Zubov, and the shadow of time. As Catherine aged, young lovers still appeared, more as a ritual of power than emotional need. Alexander Lanskoy, gentle, artistic, brought her relief in years burdened by responsibility. But when Lanskoy died young of illness, Catherine wept for days, a rare thing for a woman who had once killed her husband to claim the throne. The last, Platon Zubov, was 35 years her junior, naive in appearance but quietly ambitious, yet everyone knew he could never fill the void left by Potemkin. She kept Zubov as a symbol, a way to convince herself that she still controlled everything, even old age. Catherine once wrote, "A man can have hundreds of lovers and no one cares, but if a woman dares to love more than once, they call it a fall from grace." For her, to love was not to fall, but to choose. Every man who came to her was chosen carefully, not just for emotion, but for political, military, or diplomatic benefit. They came, and when no longer useful, they left, but no one could say they were used, because as Catherine herself said, "I gave them more than they ever dreamed of receiving." Catherine's love was not a poetic romance nor novelistic purity. It was politics dressed in silk, handwritten letters scented with perfume, but inked in strategy. Between ideals and reality, the silent battle in the heart of a queen. Catherine read Voltaire during long afternoons, where the sunlight touched each page as if illuminating a new world. She admired Montesquieu, discussing the separation of powers and the rule of law. She corresponded with Diderot, the encyclopedist of the age, like intellectual soulmates. Deep down, Catherine did not only want to rule a mighty empire, she wanted to pull Russia out of the shadows of the medieval past and bring it closer to the light of reason. But what she soon realized was this: reading Voltaire was easier than changing Russia. 18th century Russia was not like France or England. It was a society where serfs were bound like slaves, where nobles held the power of life and death over thousands of souls living on their land, and where the law was a tangled maze, serving not justice, but the protection of the privileged class. And she, a woman ruling by faith in the Enlightenment, had to walk that thorn-covered path alone. The dream, rewriting Russian law. In 1767, Catherine summoned a special commission of over 500 delegates from across social classes, nobles, officers, clergy, townspeople, with the goal of drafting a new legal code. She called it the nakaz, or instruction. It was not just a technical document, but the first Enlightenment manifesto in Russia, in which she called for equality before the law, prohibition of torture, respect for property rights, promotion of universal education, reduction of the nobility's arbitrary power. However, what she wrote, beautiful and forceful, collided head-on with the feudal structure upon which her throne stood. The Russian nobility, who had once supported her during the coup, now looked at Catherine with suspicion. They saw in her a woman too idealistic, too Western, too radical. Many opposed her in silence, some mocked her openly. In the end, the commission dissolved without a single law being officially enacted. Catherine sighed but did not retreat. She understood that reform could not come from a single meeting. It required time and the patience of a tree planter. Education, watering the seeds of enlightenment. If the laws could not be changed overnight, Catherine turned to a realm with less resistance: education. She built hundreds of public schools, especially in provincial towns, places where people had long lived in the darkness of illiteracy. In 1786, she issued the first education decree, shaping a nationwide teaching system. Schools for boys, for girls, for noble children, and for townsfolk. She hired professors from Europe to teach, translated philosophical books into Russian, and encouraged the creation of public libraries. Catherine once said, "An empire cannot be strong if its people cannot read." Yet even so, she could not reach the deepest root of inequality. Russian peasants, over 90% of the population, still had no access to knowledge. They could not study, could not travel, could not speak. They were the darkness her Enlightenment light could not yet touch. The fight against corruption and the invisible walls. Corruption in Catherine's time was not just bribes and gold-lined purses. It was a whole system of privileges, where local officials colluded with the nobility, where laws were twisted from one region to another. Catherine established financial audit councils, imposed new penalties for bribery, and even required local governments to submit annual reports. But every time she issued an order, thousands of miles away from St. Petersburg, those decrees were distorted. She once bitterly wrote in her diary, "There are places in Russia where my decrees are nothing but paper flying in the wind." She never abandoned her dream of reform, but she began to realize an emperor may conquer lands, but cannot easily change the mentality of a people long used to hierarchy, fear, and dependence. Feudalism, the shadow that would not fade. One of the greatest paradoxes of Catherine was this: she loved the Enlightenment, yet at the same time she reinforced the very feudal system that the Enlightenment opposed. In 1785, she issued the Charter to the Nobility, granting additional privileges to the local aristocracy, including land ownership, tax exemption, and the right to rule over peasants within their domains. She did this not out of desire, but as a trade-off to maintain stability in an empire too vast to govern otherwise. The serfs, those she should have liberated, were instead bound more tightly. Any notion of freeing the serfs was fiercely opposed by the nobility. She knew, if she acted on her own, her throne would be in danger, and so she remained silent before what she had once condemned. Between two worlds, Catherine alone in her own light. Catherine lived between two worlds, the world of French ideals, where power must be accompanied by morality and justice, and the world of Russia, where power was for control, and too much freedom could lead to chaos. She did not abandon her ideals, but she learned where to stop in the face of reality. Reform for her was no longer a straight path, but a spiral of compromises, where each step forward required a concession. And in the heart of a woman who once overthrew an entire dynasty now echoed questions with no answers. Can I alone change an entire people? Can light truly triumph over darkness, or does it simply reveal it more clearly? Catherine of Russia, not just a ruler, but an awakener. Even though she could not complete the legal revolution, even though reform was stifled by silent resistance, Catherine remained the initiator of an irreversible process. She did not liberate Russia, but she ignited the desire for liberation. She did not topple feudalism, but she planted the first seeds for the generations to come. And perhaps that is how history moves, in small steps, through those who dare to dream where no one else would. Expanding the empire when ideals march with conquest. If Catherine could not reform the deep roots of Russia from within, she would expand it outward. For a queen who had once overthrown her husband, the king, who had used love as strategy and reform as a long negotiation, territorial expansion was the clear, effective path, and one far easier to justify than any philosophy. To Catherine, conquest was not merely about land. It was the assertion of power, the stamping of history, and above all, a way for her to fulfill her self-declared mission to civilize the semi-barbaric lands. Crimea, the southern jewel. Nowhere embodied Catherine's ambition and political finesse more clearly than Crimea. This peninsula had long belonged to the Ottoman Empire, a strategic land by the Black Sea, once a buffer between Russia and the Muslim powers of the south. To Catherine, seizing Crimea was not just redrawing the map, but the first step in realizing the vision of a southern-facing Russian empire, one that possessed year-round warm water ports, access to the Mediterranean, and a competitive presence among Western powers. She did not rush to attack. Instead, she entrusted Grigory Potemkin, her lover and loyal partner, to establish influence, fund uprisings, and sow internal unrest in Crimea. After years of maneuvering, in 1783, Russia officially annexed Crimea, turning it into the empire's southern gateway. But Catherine did not stop there. She built new cities like Sevastopol and Simferopol, invited European engineers to plan them, constructed churches, schools, and administrative institutes, all under the banner of bringing civilization to what was once wilderness. To the West, she presented it as liberation. To the Russian people, she called it a civilizing mission. But to the local Muslim Tatars, it was cultural replacement, forced assimilation, and the suppression of centuries-old traditions. Poland, one nation, three partitions. Catherine did not only look southward, she also turned her gaze west, to Poland, Lithuania, a once powerful state now weakened from within and eyed by neighboring empires. From her youth, Catherine had interfered in Polish politics by placing her former lover, Stanisław Poniatowski, on the throne. But a weak monarch could not withstand growing pressure. So, between Catherine, Prussia, and the Habsburg Empire, a quiet agreement was made. Poland would be partitioned 3 times, in 1772, 1793, and 1795. When the partitions were complete, Poland vanished entirely from the map of Europe for over a century. To Catherine, this was not invasion, but stabilization. She claimed she was preventing chaos and preserving order. In reality, it was one of the clearest examples of how she cloaked expansionism in the guise of civilizing. Administrative reform, bringing order to new lands. When Russia's territory grew to 1.5 times its previous size under her rule, Catherine knew occupation alone was not enough. She had to establish a governance system capable of long-term control. In 1775, she issued one of the largest administrative reforms of the era, dividing Russia into over 50 provinces, gubernias, each overseen by a governor directly appointed by her, accompanied by courts, prisons, and law enforcement. Each province was a miniature version of St. Petersburg, where law, oversight, and propaganda were applied uniformly. This was how Catherine centralized the empire, curtailed the power of local nobility, and ensured that the voice from the Winter Palace echoed as far as the Caucasus Mountains or the Siberian steppe. Along with that, she established hundreds of new schools in the newly conquered areas, bringing the Russian language and Orthodox Christianity to lands that once spoke Turkish, Polish, or native tongues. All of this was recorded in history as a civilizing mission, but in reality it was a deep and comprehensive assimilation strategy. Catherine and the concept of civilization, a double-edged sword. Catherine was not a classic conqueror. She did not burn, enslave, or forcibly convert religions. Instead, she conquered through education, administration, and symbols. She erected monuments, rewarded writers who recorded her achievements, and organized grand festivals whenever a new territory was annexed. In every foreign identity, she sought to mold it into the Russian template, both to make governance easier and to craft the image of a civilized empress of the Enlightenment age. But behind that light was the silencing of small nations, the fading of native traditions, and the subtle arrangement of an imperial ideology cloaked in the language of reason and morality. Admiration and fear from Europe. The European powers viewed Catherine with a mix of admiration, and Voltaire called her the Northern Minerva. Diderot once visited her and left with feelings of both excitement and doubt. France welcomed her letters as pearls of wisdom, yet also feared that an Eastern empire was drawing closer, not only with weapons, but with ideas and strategies. Catherine, a woman not born in Russia, not a Romanov by blood, but who expanded Russia's territory more than any before her, is now remembered as a great empress. But beneath that massive map lay millions of illiterate serfs, hundreds of ethnic minorities slowly dissolving, and a local bureaucracy beginning to recreate its own privileges. One hand holding a sword, one hand holding a book, Catherine embodied her era. A woman who loved knowledge and used force, who pursued the light of enlightenment while securing her throne through absolute control. She could quote Montesquieu in her study while signing a decree to annex lands thousands of miles away. She could declare freedom for newly annexed peoples, then grant nobles unlimited rights to rule over them. It was a paradox, but also the greatness of a woman who turned ideals into tools, a country into an empire, and herself into an immortal chapter in Russian history. The final years and legacy, when the Enlightenment light quietly dimmed amid political shadows. In 1796, early autumn came to St. Petersburg. Leaves drifted down in thin layers over the cold stone outside the Winter Palace. Catherine was 67 at the time, yet still worked every day. Each morning she rose early, wrote letters, signed decrees, read reports from the provinces, and pondered the reforms left unfinished. She never stopped believing that Russia, this vast, paradoxical empire, could still be better, more civilized, and less burdened by suffering. But time shows no mercy, not even to those who once shaped history. On November 17, 1796, Catherine collapsed in her private quarters after a violent stroke. She remained in a coma for a full day, unable to speak any final words or sign the last decree she had planned, a proposal for reforming the provincial legal system. The next morning, the great Empress of Russia passed away. One death, many fears. Catherine's death was not merely the end of a person, it marked the close of an entire era. The court was shaken. Trusted confidants like Grigory Potemkin had died years earlier. Her younger lovers were cast aside. All that remained was Prince Paul, her only legitimate son, with Peter III, a son she had always kept at a cold and cautious distance. Catherine never truly trusted Paul. She had him raised under supervision, kept him from state affairs, and according to many historical sources, had even considered appointing her grandson Alexander, Paul's son, as heir instead. But she died before she could issue a decree confirming this, and so Paul became Tsar. Paul once, the one who undid his mother's legacy. If Catherine embodied light and strategy, Paul was the reflection of darkness and vengeance. Almost immediately, he began reversing his mother's entire legacy, revoked policies that expanded the nobility's autonomy, banned women from inheriting the throne to erase Catherine's precedent, restructured the military in rigid Prussian style, severed diplomatic ties aligned with Enlightenment ideals. He even had the remains of Peter III, his father, whom he had never met, reinterred with full royal honors, a symbolic retaliation against the mother who had overthrown him. To Paul, Catherine was not a model to follow, but a shadow to erase. Yet history, as always, does not bend easily to royal decrees. An empire that could not be reversed. Although Paul tried to overshadow his mother's legacy, what Catherine left behind had already become deeply embedded in the fabric of the Russian Empire. She expanded Russia's territory by more than 500,000 square kilometers, including Crimea, Belarus, Lithuania, the Black Sea coast, and parts of Poland. The map of Russia under her reign was not only vast, it had order, structure, and bore the marks of a modern mind. The schools, libraries, and academies she established did not vanish. Generations of scholars, engineers, physicians, and writers, nurtured from the seeds Catherine planted, went on to shape the brilliant Russian culture of the 19th century. The cities she planned: Sevastopol, Odessa, Yekaterinoslav, now Dnipro, Simferopol, continued to grow, keeping their names as if whispering the immortal presence of a queen who never backed down. Cultural legacy: Catherine, the woman who rewrote Russia's identity. If Peter the Great westernized Russia's image by force, Catherine Europeanized its mind with intellect. She promoted the arts, built the Royal Theatre, and developed Russian literature in connection with Europe. Under her reign, the first notable figures in Russian literature, such as Gavrila Derzhavin and Nikolai Karamzin, began to emerge, laying the foundation for the later generation of Pushkin and Tolstoy. She wrote over 12 plays, hundreds of handwritten letters, and even participated in editing curricula and textbook content. Catherine did not see herself merely as a ruler, but as a cultural guide for an entire nation. Catherine, a woman beyond her time. When history looks back on Catherine, it is difficult to fit her into a single mold. She was not entirely a figure of the Enlightenment. She still crushed peasant revolts and maintained serfdom. She was not exactly a tyrant. She encouraged intellectuals, opened schools, and engaged in dialogue with dissenters. She was no saint, nor did she ever wish to be one. She wanted to be human, but a human capable of shaping an entire era. History will not forgive us if we live merely as a shadow beside the throne. And she lived as a torch, burning through contradiction, loneliness, strength, and the belief that Russia could become great not just by the sword, but by books, by law, by reason. Catherine's death did not erase her from Russia's memory. She became the subject of thousands of studies, scripts, and films, admired yet also questioned. Debates continue. Was she a tyrant or a reformer? Did she truly love Russia or only power? But it was precisely that complexity that made her great. Not because she was perfect, but because she dared to live, dared to change, dared to take responsibility, and dared to let history judge her. And if anything survived her death, it was a Russia that would never be the same again. No longer closed off, no longer timid in the face of knowledge and progress. Wherever there are schools, justice, and debates about the future, Catherine still lives on, in memory, in the lifeblood of an empire once guided through its greatest crossroads by a foreign-born woman. From the frost of Russia to the jungles of South America, when ambition took the shape of a golden dream. When Catherine the Great died, she left behind a legacy filled with brilliance and contradiction, an empire expanded, a map redrawn with blood, ink, and a belief in reason. But she was not the only one who dreamed such grand dreams. Tens of thousands of miles southwest of Russia, across the Atlantic and into the misty forests of the New World, other men had once dreamed of power, conquest, and the glow of civilization. But they were not searching for enlightenment. They were searching for gold. El Dorado, where a dream wore the costume of myth. In the 16th century, when the Spanish set foot in the Americas, they did not only see land, resources, and native peoples. They saw, or rather imagined, stories so fantastical that no one could tell what was real and what was delusion. El Dorado, the Gilded Man, was not originally a city, but a real ritual in the Muisca culture of what is now Colombia. According to legend, whenever a new king ascended the throne, he would be covered in gold dust, then leap into Lake Guatavita as an offering to the gods. Golden rings and tiny metal figures were thrown into the water, not to flaunt wealth, but to forge a bond between the living and the divine. But when this story reached the ears of the conquistadors, Spanish warriors and explorers, it was distorted, exaggerated, and turned into a fevered dream. That somewhere deep within South America, there existed a magnificent city built entirely of gold. Golden walls, golden roofs, golden statues of gods, and streets shimmering with precious metal. El Dorado was no longer a ritual. It became a promise of absolute wealth and a sweet trap for those willing to risk their lives to find it. Sleepwalkers in the jungle. Unlike Catherine, who conquered with strategy and reason, the seekers of El Dorado were souls both brave, reckless, and blind. The first to embark on the journey was Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada in 1537. He ventured into Colombia's interior, crossed the Magdalena River, cut through the jungle, and eventually encountered the Muisca people. Though he never found the city of gold, he seized a large amount of gems and precious metals. The tale of the Gilded Man began there and spread like wildfire. Soon after, it was Francisco de Orellana, a fearless dreamer, who set out to explore the Amazon in hopes of finding El Dorado. He became the first European to traverse the entire length of the Amazon River, but the cost was devastating. Nearly his entire expedition perished due to malaria, starvation, wild animals, and attacks by indigenous tribes. El Dorado remained a shadow in the jungle mist, almost real, but never within reach. Then came Sir Walter Raleigh, an ambitious English nobleman. At the end of the 16th century, he led 2 expeditions into what is now Venezuela and Guyana, claiming to the English crown that El Dorado was real, and that England must seize it before Spain. Raleigh found nothing but mud, dry rivers, and indigenous peoples living in poverty. Yet he wrote books, drew maps, and constructed the image of a golden empire, justifying failure with legend. El Dorado, a fever with no cure. El Dorado was never a fixed location. Each generation of explorers moved it farther, deeper, more fantastical, from Colombia to Venezuela, then Peru, the Amazon, Guyana. When one expedition failed, people said, perhaps they didn't go far enough. And so the next ones went, armed with maps, guns, rum, and bottomless dreams. Thousands died. Entire regions of the Americas were ravaged by greed. Yet El Dorado never appeared. Like a sorcerer's mirror, it reflected not the truth, but the soul of the one who looked into it. A dream or a sentence? If Catherine called the expansion of her empire civilization, then those who sought El Dorado justified themselves in much the same way. They said they brought Christian light to wild lands. They claimed to seek justice, doctrine, and order. But in the end, all they carried were ships full of gold, blood, and the pain of millions of indigenous people. El Dorado was not just a place that never existed. It was a metaphor for humanity's insatiable nature. And though centuries have passed, it still lives on in pop culture, in books and films, a beautiful ghost. No longer do we ask, where is it? But why did we ever believe it? From golden palaces to deadly jungles, ambition can wear many faces. For Catherine, it was schools and administrative centers in new lands. For the conquistadors, it was imagined rivers flowing with gold. For history, it was chapters both glorious and soaked in blood, dreams carved into human remains. El Dorado may never have existed, but thousands died believing in it. And that, in the end, is more real than any treasure map humanity has ever drawn. The truth behind the legend, when El Dorado might have existed, but not in the way we imagined. For centuries, El Dorado lived on as a symbol of greed, a golden curse that lured expeditions into the South American jungle like moths to flame, none of them returning with a complete story. It is remembered as a delusion, a fake treasure map, born of misunderstanding, desire, and the imagination of those chasing power. Yet in recent years, science has begun to shed light on a different perspective. What if El Dorado was never purely a myth? Memory beneath the forest canopy. For a long time, scientists believed that the Amazon rainforest was a wild, inhospitable land, lacking the resources to support large-scale civilizations. This assumption reinforced the idea that El Dorado was nothing more than an illusion, because in a place like that, there could never have been glittering cities of gold or even a complex society. But then, starting in the early 21st century, advanced archaeological technologies such as LiDAR, light detection and ranging, scanning the ground with aerial lasers, changed everything. Beneath the dense jungle canopy of the Amazon, lines, geometric shapes, and buried architecture began to emerge on 3D maps. Plazas, canals, trail systems, remnants of dwellings, and even structures organized in urban layouts. These discoveries did not occur in just one place, but scattered across Bolivia, Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. They suggest that densely populated, organized, and symbolically rich communities once existed deep within the Amazon, and that the memory of these societies may have evolved into the legend of El Dorado. The forest builders. One of the most significant discoveries is the evidence of artificial land cultivation systems. In a place once thought to be unsuitable for large-scale agriculture, ancient indigenous peoples developed terra preta, Amazonian dark earth, an especially fertile soil created by adding biochar, organic waste, and ash. This soil was not only sustainably fertile, but spread over hundreds of kilometers, a testament to the indigenous people's sophisticated ecological knowledge. They did not merely live off the forest, they shaped it, creating semi-artificial ecosystems for living, farming, and spiritual practices. It is within these types of settlements that archaeologists found finely carved ceramics, small metal figurines, and traces possibly linked to gold leaf rituals, closely resembling the legends of the Muisca people. El Dorado, from man to place, from place to memory. The legend of El Dorado may have begun with a man, a king covered in gold who leapt into a sacred lake. But over time, the memory of that man accumulated new details, transforming into a city, an empire, a dreamlike land. If Europeans had arrived in the Amazon at the height of these civilizations, with small cities lining the rivers, ceremonial plazas, and carved temples, it would be entirely understandable why they imagined El Dorado. But when they returned, they saw nothing. Because by the 16th and 17th centuries, most of those cultures had silently collapsed. What killed El Dorado wasn't myth, but disease. A theory widely supported by historians and archaeologists suggests that when Europeans came to the New World, they brought deadly diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles, to which the indigenous people had no immunity. Within just a few decades, the population of interior forest regions may have declined by 90 to 95%, rendering once vibrant cities nearly deserted within a single generation. There was no one left to maintain agriculture. The wild forest grew back, swallowing all traces of ancestors. When Spanish and Portuguese expeditions later returned to search for El Dorado, everything had vanished, leaving behind exactly what they had expected, an unbelievable dream. It was this unusual silence that led European historians to conclude that no real civilization had ever existed here, and that the legend of El Dorado was merely rumor. Restoring historical memory from fantasy to legacy. Today, researchers are reshaping the way we view the Amazon, not as a pristine wilderness untouched by man, but as a post-civilization space, a place where people once lived, where memories and social systems once thrived, then were erased from the dominant historical narrative. El Dorado, in its deepest sense, may be a distorted memory of civilizations that Europeans did not understand, did not record adequately, and ultimately forgot. But that memory is not entirely dead. It lives again in fragments of pottery and bronze necklaces, in LiDAR maps that reveal perfect circles hidden in what seems like endless forest. And perhaps the most miraculous thing is, we no longer need to believe El Dorado was a city of material gold, because it truly existed in the form of human creativity, culture, and extraordinary adaptability. From Catherine to the Amazon, a journey back to humanity. If Catherine once believed that civilization could come from schools, laws, and reason, then the ancient inhabitants of the Amazon show us that civilization can also emerge from the jungle, from dark earth, from the rhythm of nature and indigenous belief. El Dorado, in its new understanding, is no longer a city of gold. It is proof that humanity, regardless of place or circumstance, can create wonders if only given enough time to tell its own story. A human metaphor. El Dorado as a mirror to the self. In the end, El Dorado is not just a point on a map, not a golden city, not a hidden treasure, not a betrayed dream. It is humanity's mirror, reflecting what we pursue not only in the Amazon jungle, but in every realm of life, from personal ambition to the urge to explore, from faith to love. El Dorado is not in Colombia, Venezuela, or Peru. El Dorado lies within every person, in that space we call the unknown. The desire to transcend the ordinary. From afar, the 16th century explorers may seem delusional. They plunged into jungles without maps, without food, without understanding the local languages, just to find a city no one had ever seen. They wagered their lives, their reason, their reputation, for a faint chance at discovering something beyond human imagination. And when they failed, they still did not stop. One failed, the next continued. No one asked, does El Dorado exist? They only asked, have we not gone far enough? That question is the essence of the human spirit of exploration. Whether in scientific research, art, or inner life, we all have our own El Dorado. An idea not yet formed, a truth not yet grasped, a dream still shrouded, and for it, we are willing to abandon the safety of the known. In work, El Dorado is the unreached peak. For those building a career, El Dorado is the ambition to go beyond limits, not just high salaries or titles, but the feeling that one is doing something meaningful, leaving a mark, changing the world in some way. A scientist devotes a lifetime to a reaction never proven. An artist struggles for years to capture a moment of truth in music. An entrepreneur fails 5 times but keeps going, believing their idea could shape the future. No one guarantees there is gold at the end of that path, but they still walk it, not because success is certain, but because not walking it would mean betraying who they are. El Dorado in work is not achievement, but the refusal to settle for mediocrity. In love, El Dorado is the one we keep searching for. Some relationships are like the journey to El Dorado. They begin with hope, continue with passion, and may end in doubt. Yet strangely, even after heartbreak, people still choose to love again. Love, in some sense, is a journey without a map. We step into it carrying a suitcase full of emotions, yet we have no idea whether the destination is real. Every lover who has passed through our lives is a trace, like the hidden trails of the Amazon, leading us closer to something deeper than ourselves. People often say, each of us has an El Dorado, someone we search for our entire lives, sometimes meeting them, sometimes not. But even if we never find them, the journey is still worthwhile. Because in seeking another, we come to understand ourselves better, love ourselves more, and grow. In faith, El Dorado is the answer to the question we dare not ask. El Dorado is also the image of a sacred quest, the force that makes humans look up at the sky and ask, where do I come from? Who am I in this universe? From monks living in Himalayan caves, to theologians wrestling with the idea of God in the age of science, from pilgrims crossing deserts to Zen masters sitting in silence, all are seekers of El Dorado in spirit. There is no map, no clear destination, but there is one certainty: belief in something greater than oneself can save us from meaninglessness, from the darkness. El Dorado in faith is not an epiphany, but an unquenchable longing. The failure and the beauty of El Dorado. Someone once said, El Dorado is not worth as much as the journey to find it. Indeed, in history, no one ever found El Dorado, but thanks to the dream of it, maps were redrawn, civilizations discovered, and the world, both literally and metaphorically, grew larger. Just like human beings, not everyone achieves their life's greatest goal, but through every step, every attempt, every failure, we get closer to our true selves. El Dorado is not out there. It lives within the journey that is never perfect, but always essential. Each era has its own El Dorado. During the conquest of South America, El Dorado was gold. For Catherine the Great, El Dorado was an empire enlightened by reason. For modern people, El Dorado might be freedom, justice, love, or an unanswered question. What never changes is this: we keep searching. And perhaps it is that endless search, even with no final arrival, that allows humanity to rise above instinct and touch meaning. El Dorado does not exist for us to conquer. It exists so that we have something worth believing in. From El Dorado to Olympia, when humans sought not only gold but also glory. If El Dorado is a symbol of humanity's endless pursuit of the unknown, then in another corner of the world, under the dry heat of the ancient Greek peninsula, people once sought something just as radiant: glory, through strength and will. Not through wealth, but through the body, speed, courage, and honor. That was the spirit of the ancient Olympics, a tradition born over 2,700 years ago in a narrow valley by the Alpheus River, where the name Olympia would live on in the history of humankind. Olympia, where humans competed before the gods. Legend has it the first Olympic Games were held in 776 BC as a sacred ritual honoring Zeus, the supreme god of Mount Olympus. Every 4 years, the Greek city-states, even those at war, declared a truce to send athletes to Olympia to compete. There were no medals, no prize money. What they sought was the olive wreath, the roar of the crowd, and immortal status in collective memory. The events were very different from today's, including running, discus throw, wrestling, horse racing, boxing, and even pankration, a brutal no-rules combat sport where the last one standing won. All were performed in the spirit of arit, the pursuit of excellence in both body and virtue. The Olympics were no game. They were the space where Greeks believed mortals could approach the divine, not through prayer, but by surpassing themselves. The Colossus of Rhodes, when glory was carved in stone and bronze. If Olympia was the place where mortals proved themselves worthy of the gods, then in the southeast of Greece, on the prosperous island of Rhodes, the divine was sculpted as a giant, a tribute to the pride of a people who once triumphed over fate. In 305 BC, Rhodes was besieged for an entire year by King Demetrius of Macedonia. But with resilience and clever strategy, the people of Rhodes repelled the mighty army and forced Demetrius to retreat. Instead of building fortresses or minting victory coins, the Rhodians chose something different: to build a colossal statue in gratitude to Helios, the sun god who had protected the island. And thus, the Colossus of Rhodes was born. Colossus, a grand symbol of humanity amidst the cosmos. The statue was constructed over a period of 12 years and completed in 280 BCE. According to ancient records, it stood about 33 meters tall, roughly the same height as the Statue of Liberty, making it one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Colossus was more than just a sculpture. It was a declaration from a small city to the world. We did not surrender. The people of Rhodes melted down the weapons and war tools left behind by their enemies to cast the statue of the god, transforming war into peace, instruments of death into an immortal symbol. The god Helios stood upright, facing the sea, holding a torch, an image that would later inspire the Statue of Liberty in the United States. And then the Colossus fell, but did not disappear. Only 56 years after its completion, in 226 BCE, a devastating earthquake caused the Colossus to collapse, breaking into 3 parts and falling into the harbor of Rhodes. Yet, the people chose not to rebuild it, for legend had it that Helios was angered and they respected that belief. However, what is remarkable is this: even as broken pieces lying on the ground, the Colossus was never forgotten. Visitors to the island of Rhodes continued to come see the moss-covered bronze fragments as though they were the remains of a fallen god. Children played beside the colossal broken foot. Adults bowed their heads while passing the site where the statue once stood. And in the Greek consciousness, and that of the world thereafter, the Colossus remained a symbol of pride that would never be extinguished. Olympics and Colossus, 2 faces of the same longing. One is the arena, where humans measure their strength. The other is the statue, where humans measure their pride. Both speak to a single truth: humanity has always longed to be remembered, not for power, but for the effort to rise above the finite. The Olympics teach us about physical limits and how to break them through discipline, training, and spirit. The Colossus reminds us that honor is not found in immortality, but in standing tall and shining even when collapse is inevitable. They are the Eldorados of the ancient world, not meant to be conquered, but to be passed down, dreamed of, and kept alive in human memory. Connecting El Dorado with Olympia and Rhodes, the journey from illusion to legacy. From the gold fever in the jungles of South America, to the echoing footsteps at Olympia, to the giant statue guarding the island of Rhodes, all are different expressions of the same ancient energy: the desire to rise, to leave a mark, and to live beyond the physical body. El Dorado was never found. The Colossus fell. The ancient Olympics were erased for over 1,000 years before being reborn. But they did not die. They live on through memory, through legend, through carvings on stone, and in the consciousness of every modern soul, each one still chasing their own El Dorado, competing in invisible Olympics, and sculpting colossuses unseen but universally felt. The El Dorados, Colossuses, and Olympics of humanity. History is not written solely by wars and dynasties. It is etched through dreams, unending quests, and symbols raised not to last forever, but to live on in the minds of those who come after. We've passed through El Dorado, the dream of a golden city deep in the South American jungle. It was a place where ambition and illusion entwined, where thousands gambled their lives for something no one could prove real. But now, thanks to science and archaeology, we know El Dorado was not entirely a myth. It may have been the forgotten memory of a vibrant civilization, one that once knew how to make fertile soil in the Amazon and performed gilded rituals to connect humans with the divine. El Dorado, then, is not found at the journey's end, but is the journey itself. We've run through Olympia, where ancient Greeks did more than compete. They lifted themselves to the level of gods with every breath, every stretch, every life or death wrestling match. Their victory wasn't about winning prizes, but about standing before the multitudes and facing oneself. Olympic, then, is not a contest, but a rite of passage. And then we come before the Colossus, the giant statue of a sun god, the symbol of a small people who dared to defy empire and declare themselves through art greater than war. The The Colossus of Rhodes may have fallen in an earthquake, but in human memory, it never lost its upright stance. Colossus is pride cast into form, glory without conquest, the eternal voice of those who once stood tall against the storm. Colossus then is no longer a statue, but courage made solid, the dreams that stretch from antiquity to the present. Today, we no longer ride into the forest searching for gold, nor do we build statues to honor the sun god. But we are still seeking El Dorado in new forms, working relentlessly to achieve something others believe is impossible. Racing against time, technology, and physical limits like athletes, scientists, and creators do every day. Creating new colossi, not of stone or bronze, but of cultural symbols, ideas, inventions, and spiritual legacies. We are still searching, still striving, still building things that may collapse in the physical world but remain immortal in spirit. Why do humans keep dreaming? Because there is something in our nature that cannot rest within the bounds of what is real. We always think of what doesn't yet exist, believe in what is unseen, and move toward places no one has reached. El Dorado, Colossus, Olympic. Each name is a reminder. We don't just live, we long to leave a mark. Not for fame, but to affirm that we once lived fully, overcame fear, and dared to go all the way. Where are you on that journey? Perhaps you're searching for your own El Dorado, a dream yet to come true. Perhaps you're in the middle of your personal Olympic, where you strive each day to surpass your own limits. Perhaps you're building an invisible colossus, a project, an idea, a legacy that will outlive you. And perhaps you've also felt disappointment. You've fallen. You've doubted whether you could keep going. But remember, El Dorado is not found at the destination. It lives in every step you take. The Colossus doesn't need to stand forever. It only needs to have stood once. That's enough. The Olympic doesn't need spectators. As long as you don't give up on yourself, you've already won. Aspiration, that is humanity's most enduring legacy. The world will keep changing. Monuments will fall, maps will be redrawn, but the desire to transcend oneself to reach what's never been touched, that flame will never die. We, whether explorers of the 16th century, empresses of the 18th, or ordinary people of the 21st, share the same pulse, the need to live deeply, boldly, and meaningfully. And if you find yourself somewhere on that path, tired, uncertain, wondering if there is any El Dorado meant for you, then remember, the very fact that you are still walking is proof that El Dorado is still there. So don't fear failure, don't fear falling, don't fear the unknown, because every great thing ever written in human history began with one person who dared to dream and refused to stop. And so we've journeyed together through slices of history, from the throne of Catherine the Great to the mysterious Amazonian jungles where El Dorado remains an enigma, from the athletic spirit of ancient Greece to the fallen yet undying silhouette of the Colossus of Rhodes. Each story is more than a chapter of the past. It is a mirror reflecting ambition, faith, courage, and the very human limits we all carry. How do you feel after this journey? Did something spark reflection in you? Was there a story that left a lasting mark? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Your voice means a lot to us. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And before you drift off to sleep, don't forget to send out some warm goodnight wishes. Wishing you a peaceful night and the sweetest dreams.